They laughed at the quiet woman standing alone at gate C-17, assuming she was just another confused passenger who didn't belong in first class. But less than 1 hour later, the same people would stand frozen in silence, realizing they had humiliated one of the most powerful women in the entire airline industry. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The massive windows of Reagan National Airport glowed orange beneath the fading evening sunlight as hundreds of travelers rushed across polished marble floors, dragging carry-ons behind them. Boarding announcements echoed through the crowded terminal while exhausted parents calmed, crying children, and business travelers stared down at glowing phone screens filled with unread emails. Near gate C-17, surrounded by expensive luggage and sharply dressed executives, sat a woman almost nobody noticed. Vivian Cole rested quietly in a gray wool coat with a small leather carry-on beside her chair. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, and unlike the travelers around her, she wasn't scrolling endlessly through her phone or speaking loudly into a headset to impress strangers. Instead, she sat calmly reviewing a thin stack of printed documents resting in her lap. At 41 years old, Vivian carried herself with the kind of composure that only came from years of responsibility, pressure, and decisions capable of changing thousands of lives. But to everyone passing by, she looked completely ordinary. No designer purse, no flashy jewelry, no personal assistant hovering nearby, no signs of wealth or status. And in places like airports, appearances often became silent social currency. A group of sharply dressed passengers gathered near the priority boarding lane glanced toward her before quickly looking away with subtle expressions of judgment. One man smirked quietly to another, while adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy suit. Nearby, gate supervisor Melissa Grant stood behind the boarding counter reviewing passenger upgrades with the focused intensity of someone who treated status as a sacred system. At 38, Melissa had built her entire identity around appearances. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, perfect smile for wealthy customers. She believed she could identify a person's value within seconds simply by looking at their clothes, shoes, and posture. And the moment her eyes landed on Vivian Cole, Melissa had already made her decision. Not important, not priority, not someone worth attention. The loudspeaker chimed softly overhead. American Airlines Flight 427 to Seattle will begin boarding shortly. Several first-class passengers immediately formed a loose line near the priority lane. Melissa's demeanor changed instantly as she greeted them with polished warmth, her voice suddenly sweeter, more attentive, more respectful. Vivian slowly stood from her seat and picked up her small carry-on before calmly stepping toward the same boarding line. That was when the atmosphere shifted. Melissa's eyes narrowed almost immediately. Her professional smile disappeared by a fraction. She looked Vivian up and down once, then again, lingering briefly on the woman's simple white sneakers and plain gray coat. The judgment was instant and merciless. Nearby, Ethan Holloway watched the interaction with growing amusement. Ethan was the type of businessman who treated airports like personal stages. Expensive watch, loud voice, tailored charcoal jacket worth more than most people's monthly rent. He carried himself with the smug confidence of a man accustomed to being prioritized everywhere he went. And as Vivian quietly approached the priority lane beside him, Ethan's mouth curled slightly into a grin. He already sensed what was about to happen. Melissa reached forward with an open palm before Vivian could even scan her boarding pass. "Ma'am," she said sharply, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This line is reserved for priority boarding only." Several heads turned immediately. Vivian remained calm. "Yes," she replied softly, holding out her boarding pass. Melissa barely glanced at it before speaking again. "Economy boarding hasn't started yet." Ethan let out a quiet chuckle beside her. "Looks like everyone wants first-class treatment these days," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for others nearby to hear. A few passengers smirked. Vivian's expression never changed. Her eyes remained steady, unreadable, almost impossibly calm beneath the bright terminal lights. And somewhere down the jet bridge, unseen by anyone at gate C-17, a senior flight attendant had just frozen after reading a message on her phone that made the color drain from her face. The boarding scanner emitted a soft red flash as Melissa pulled Vivian's boarding pass back without scanning it completely. Her expression tightened with quiet suspicion while the line behind them continued growing longer and more impatient by the second. "I am going to need you to step aside for a moment," Melissa said, folding her arms with rehearsed authority. The shift in her tone immediately drew attention from nearby passengers. Ethan Holloway adjusted the strap of his expensive leather briefcase and smirked openly now, clearly entertained by the unfolding scene. Vivian remained still beside the priority lane, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her carry-on. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked calmly. Melissa tapped the keyboard sharply while pretending to review the reservation in greater detail than necessary. "There appears to be an issue with your boarding status," she replied. "First-class passengers usually complete check-in through our concierge desk." The emphasis on usually carried a quiet accusation beneath it. Vivian nodded once. "I checked in through the mobile application this morning." Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. The answer irritated her because it left no opening for correction. Behind them, passengers shifted impatiently. The low hum of airport conversations blended with rolling luggage wheels and distant boarding announcements echoing through the terminal. But around gate C-17, attention was narrowing entirely onto the woman in the gray coat. Ethan leaned slightly closer toward another businessman standing beside him. "I travel every week," he said loudly enough to carry. "You can always tell who actually belongs in first class." A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable smiles. One younger woman standing farther back frowned at the comment but stayed silent. Vivian never reacted. That calmness unsettled Melissa more than anger would have. Most passengers became defensive when embarrassed publicly. Most raised their voices, argued, or panicked under pressure. Vivian did none of those things. Her composure remained almost unnaturally steady, as though she had seen situations like this many times before. Melissa glanced again at the boarding pass. The ticket clearly displayed first-class priority access, but now her pride had become involved. Backing down publicly would feel like losing authority in front of the entire gate. "Ma'am," Melissa said more firmly, "there are security protocols for premium travelers. We need to confirm identification before proceeding." Ethan laughed softly. "Translation," he muttered, "wrong line." This time, several people openly chuckled. The sound echoed harsher than intended beneath the cold airport lighting. Vivian slowly reached into her coat pocket and handed over her identification without protest. Melissa took it with visible confidence, expecting to find some inconsistency that justified her suspicions. But as her eyes moved across the license, confusion flickered briefly across her face. Vivian Cole. The name sounded familiar somehow. Very familiar. Yet Melissa could not immediately place it. Before she could think further, a voice crackled suddenly through the gate intercom behind her. "Melissa, please contact operations immediately." It was the gate supervisor upstairs. Melissa quickly pressed the response button. "Busy right now," she answered quietly while keeping her eyes fixed on Vivian. "It is urgent," the voice insisted. "Operations says priority verification needs immediate confirmation." Melissa frowned. The timing irritated her. She handed Vivian's identification back with controlled annoyance. "Please wait to the side until we complete verification." Vivian accepted the card calmly. Of course. She stepped aside without argument and stood near the large terminal windows overlooking the runway where rain had begun falling lightly across the blinking airport lights. The silence around her felt strangely heavy now. Several passengers continued staring. Others pretended not to watch while listening carefully anyway. Ethan shook his head with smug amusement. "I swear airlines are getting too soft," he said. "Everybody thinks they are important these days." Then something subtle changed. A senior flight attendant suddenly emerged from the jet bridge entrance, holding a tablet tightly against her chest. Her face looked pale beneath the bright terminal lights. She scanned the waiting passengers anxiously before her eyes landed on Vivian, standing quietly near the window. The woman froze completely. For half a second, she looked like someone who had just realized a terrible mistake had already been made. She immediately turned toward Melissa with visible alarm. "Melissa," she whispered urgently as she approached the counter. Who stopped her boarding? Melissa straightened defensively. There is a verification issue. The flight attendant stared at her in disbelief. Verification issue, she repeated carefully. Then she lowered her voice even further. Do you have any idea who that woman is? The room seemed to shrink around those words. Even Ethan's confident smile faded slightly as the tension in the air shifted into something colder, quieter, and suddenly far more dangerous. Melissa stared at the senior flight attendant with visible irritation, unwilling to surrender control of the situation in front of a crowded gate full of watching passengers. I asked if there was a problem, she said sharply. Her ticket triggered a verification review. The flight attendant glanced nervously toward Vivian, standing quietly beside the terminal windows. Rain streaked softly across the glass behind her, while runway lights blinked through the darkening evening outside. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Everyone else at gate C-17 looked restless, loud, impatient. Vivian looked completely still. Melissa, the flight attendant whispered again, lowering her voice. Further, operations flagged her profile personally. Melissa folded her arms tighter. And the woman hesitated. And the executive office was notified the second her reservation checked in. Those words landed differently. Even Ethan Holloway stopped pretending not to listen now. His confident posture stiffened slightly, while nearby passengers exchanged curious glances. Melissa forced out a dry laugh. Executive office? She repeated. For her. The flight attendant did not answer immediately, which only deepened the tension hanging around the gate. Melissa looked back toward Vivian with renewed suspicion, almost searching for proof that the woman standing near the windows could not possibly deserve the sudden concern spreading through airline staff. Vivian remained calm, reviewing something quietly on her phone now, as if none of this mattered to her at all. That calmness irritated Melissa more every second. Look, Melissa said, straightening her uniform jacket. I have been doing this for 11 years. I know exactly what premium travelers look like. Ethan smirked again, encouraged by her confidence. Exactly, he added. People who fly first class usually do not show up looking like they are headed to buy groceries. A few nervous laughs followed, weaker this time. The atmosphere had changed. People were no longer entirely certain who was right anymore. The senior flight attendant looked horrified by Ethan's comment, but before she could respond, another voice suddenly broke through the tension. Melissa Grant. Everyone turned toward the corridor leading from the secured operations hallway. A tall man in a Navy pilot uniform was walking directly toward the gate with quick measured steps. 4 silver stripes gleamed beneath the bright terminal lighting. Captain Adrian Mercer rarely entered boarding areas personally unless something serious required attention. Even Melissa recognized him immediately. Her posture changed at once. Captain Mercer, she said quickly, forcing professionalism back into her voice. We are simply resolving a boarding verification issue. Adrian's eyes moved past her instantly toward Vivian. The moment he saw her, his expression changed completely. Not surprise. Recognition. Immediate recognition. He walked straight past Melissa without another glance and stopped several feet in front of Vivian Cole. Then something happened that nobody at gate C-17 expected. The veteran captain of a major airline straightened his posture respectfully and extended his hand toward the quiet woman everyone had been mocking only moments earlier. Ms. Cole, he said calmly, I sincerely apologize for the delay. We were informed you had arrived, but I did not realize there had been an issue at the gate. The entire boarding area went silent. Ethan's smile vanished instantly. Melissa looked as though all the air had disappeared from her lungs. Vivian shook the captain's hand politely. It is fine, Captain Mercer, she replied softly. Your staff appeared concerned about my boarding status. Adrian's eyes shifted briefly toward Melissa. The silence around the gate became suffocating. Nearby passengers who had laughed earlier suddenly avoided eye contact altogether. One businessman quietly lowered his phone after pretending to text, while secretly recording the confrontation moments before. Melissa swallowed hard. Captain, she began carefully. There must be some misunderstanding here. We were following protocol. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but the sharpness in his eyes intensified. Protocol, he repeated quietly. Then he looked directly at the still unscanned boarding pass in Melissa's hand. You stopped priority boarding for Vivian Cole? Melissa's confidence cracked visibly now. I was only verifying identification. Adrian let out a slow breath through his nose before lowering his voice. "Do you understand," he said carefully, "that Ms. Cole is personally meeting with our board of directors in Seattle tonight?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words seemed to freeze the entire gate in place. Ethan blinked several times as realization slowly crept across his face. Melissa's expression turned pale beneath the terminal lights. But the true shock had not arrived yet. Because at that exact moment, two black SUVs became visible through the rain outside on the private runway access road. Their headlights cutting across the wet tarmac as airport operations personnel suddenly began rushing toward gate C-17 with expressions of pure alarm. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the terminal as two airport operations executives appeared from the secured hallway near the gate entrance, both moving with the tense urgency of men trying to contain a disaster before it became irreversible. Their polished dress shoes struck sharply against the marble floor while passengers instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. One of the executives held a phone tightly against his ear while the other scanned the crowded boarding area with visible alarm. The moment they spotted Vivian Cole standing beside the windows, both men immediately changed direction toward her. Melissa's face lost what little color remained. Ethan Holloway slowly lowered his expensive coffee cup, no longer smiling now. The executive ending his phone call stopped directly in front of Vivian and offered a respectful nod. "Ms. Cole," he said carefully, "I am Thomas Riley, Senior Vice President of Operations. I sincerely apologize for the confusion this evening." The room went completely silent again. Even the boarding scanner stopped beeping as agents behind the counter froze mid-motion. Vivian offered a polite smile, calm as ever. "There is no confusion," she replied gently. "Your staff simply made assumptions." The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be. The words landed harder than anger ever could have. Melissa stood motionless behind the counter, her mouth slightly open as panic slowly settled into her expression. Thomas Riley turned toward her with disbelief written plainly across his face. "You delayed Miss Cole's boarding?" Melissa swallowed hard before forcing out an answer. "Sir, I was following gate verification procedure." The second executive stared at the untouched boarding pass still lying beside the scanner. "Verification?" he repeated quietly. "Do you realize the board has spent 3 months negotiating tonight's meeting?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably now, trying to disappear into the crowd that only minutes earlier had encouraged his smug amusement. But several passengers had already begun whispering after hearing the name Vivian Cole repeated by airline leadership. One younger traveler quickly searched the name on his phone. The moment the search results appeared, his eyes widened. "Oh my God," he whispered under his breath. Another passenger leaned closer. "What?" The man turned the screen slightly. "That is her." Within seconds, quiet murmurs spread across the gate like electricity moving through water. Vivian Cole was not merely some executive flying first class. She was the founder and chief executive officer of Alteris Aerospace Technologies, the private aviation infrastructure company that had recently dominated financial headlines across the country. Her company specialized in advanced airline systems, airport modernization, and emergency operational restructuring. Just 2 weeks earlier, national business media had reported that Alteris was preparing a multi-billion-dollar partnership capable of rescuing one of America's struggling airline giants from massive financial losses. And tonight's closed-door meeting in Seattle was rumored to determine the final agreement. Melissa's breathing visibly changed. The realization was crushing. She had not humiliated a random passenger. She had publicly insulted the woman whose signature could determine the future of the airline itself. Ethan's face turned pale as nearby passengers slowly looked toward him with growing judgment. The confidence he carried earlier evaporated completely beneath the harsh airport lighting. Captain Adrian Mercer remained standing quietly beside Vivian, watching the silence spread through the gate. He had flown for the airline nearly 20 years and understood something many people forgot. The most dangerous kind of power rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived quietly, calmly, sometimes wearing gray sneakers and carrying a single leather bag. Thomas Riley quickly turned toward the airline staff gathered nearby. "Clear the jet bridge immediately," he ordered, "and prepare private transport accommodations after landing." Then he looked back toward Vivian carefully. "Ms. Cole, the board members are already waiting at SeaTac. We have arranged direct." Escort service upon arrival. Vivian nodded politely. Thank you. Melissa suddenly stepped forward from behind the counter, her composure collapsing entirely now. Ms. Cole, she stammered softly. I sincerely apologize if there was any misunderstanding. Vivian finally looked directly at her for the first time since the confrontation began. Her expression remained composed, almost gentle, which somehow made the moment even more painful for Melissa. You were not confused, Vivian said quietly. You were comfortable judging someone you believed had no importance. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Melissa's eyes dropped toward the floor immediately. The shame spreading across her face became impossible to hide. Nearby passengers who had laughed earlier now avoided even looking in her direction. The silence surrounding gate C-17 no longer felt awkward. It felt heavy, final. And as rain continued sliding down the massive airport windows behind Vivian Cole, the people standing there began realizing they were witnessing something far larger than a boarding dispute. They were witnessing the moment arrogance collided with dignity and lost completely. For several long seconds, nobody at gate C-17 dared say another word. The only sounds remaining were the distant rumble of thunder outside and the soft tapping of rain against the giant airport windows overlooking the runway. Melissa Grant stood frozen behind the counter while passengers carefully avoided looking directly at her. Moments earlier, she had spoken with complete authority, confident that appearance alone gave her the right to decide who deserved respect. Now that confidence had collapsed in front of an entire terminal. Vivian Cole calmly picked up her boarding pass from the counter and slipped it into the pocket of her gray coat. Her movements remained steady, controlled, almost graceful beneath the harsh white terminal lights. Captain Adrian Mercer glanced toward the growing crowd gathering farther down the concourse. More airport staff were quietly arriving now after hearing whispers spread through operations channels about the incident at Gate C-17. Several employees stared at Vivian with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. Alteris Aerospace had become one of the most powerful companies in modern aviation infrastructure, and Vivian herself had developed a near-mythical reputation in corporate circles. She was known for billion-dollar negotiations, airport modernization projects, and strategic rescues that saved failing transportation systems across the country. Yet almost nobody recognized her in public because she deliberately avoided media attention. No glamorous interviews. No celebrity appearances. No social media empire. She believed power worked best when it did not need to announce itself. Thomas Riley cleared his throat carefully before speaking again. Ms. Cole, the board asked me to personally ensure your comfort tonight. We have arranged anything you may need upon arrival. Vivian offered a small polite smile. I only needed a seat on the plane. The simplicity of the statement landed heavily in the silence around them. Ethan Holloway looked physically uncomfortable now, shifting his weight while pretending to check messages on his phone. But every few seconds his eyes flickered nervously toward Vivian. He remembered every smug word he had spoken only minutes earlier, and judging by the expressions around him, so did everyone else. Nearby passengers no longer viewed him as sophisticated or important. They saw exactly what Vivian's presence had exposed. A man who measured human value through clothing, status, and superficial appearance. Melissa finally stepped out from behind the boarding counter. Her polished professionalism had completely disappeared now, replaced by visible embarrassment. Ms. Cole, she said quietly, I truly am sorry. Vivian studied her silently for a moment. The airport lights reflected softly in the polished marble floors between them, while the entire gate seemed suspended in stillness waiting for her response. Can I ask you something? Vivian said calmly. Melissa nodded immediately. When I first approached the gate, Vivian continued, what exactly made you decide I did not belong here? Melissa opened her mouth, then stopped. No answer came, because the truth sounded ugly when spoken aloud. It was the sneakers, the simple coat, the absence of luxury labels, the quietness, the fact that Vivian looked ordinary. Melissa lowered her eyes toward the floor. I made assumptions, she admitted softly. Vivian gave a slow nod. Most people do. There was no anger in her voice. That somehow made the shame worse. Around them, several passengers listened with complete attention now. Even airport employees stood unusually still. The moment no longer felt like a public embarrassment. It felt like a lesson nobody expected to receive while waiting for a flight. Vivian glanced briefly through the rain-covered windows toward the dark runway beyond. My father worked 27 years loading luggage at airports, she said quietly. When I was little, he used to tell me something every time we traveled. The room remained silent. He said airports reveal who people really are because everyone believes they are in a hurry and nobody thinks they will see each other again. Ethan slowly lowered his gaze. Melissa looked close to tears now. Vivian turned back toward her gently. Respect becomes easy when someone looks powerful, she said. Character is revealed by how you treat people who look ordinary. Nobody moved. The words settled over the gate, like a final judgment, far heavier than public humiliation. Captain Mercer himself looked thoughtful now, staring quietly at the floor. Thomas Riley exhaled slowly beside him. In all his years managing airline operations, he had watched executives scream at employees, celebrities demand special treatment, and wealthy passengers throw tantrums over delayed flights. But he had almost never witnessed someone with genuine power handle humiliation with such calm dignity. Vivian adjusted the strap of her carry-on lightly. I believe we should board now, she said softly. Melissa immediately stepped aside from the boarding lane. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached toward the scanner. This time, when Vivian's boarding pass passed beneath the light, the scanner flashed bright green and emitted a clean, soft tone that echoed through the silent gate, like the closing note of a lesson nobody there would ever forget. The soft green light from the boarding scanner reflected briefly across Vivian Cole's calm expression as she stepped forward toward the jet bridge, her small carry-on rolling quietly behind her. Nobody in the boarding area moved. Nobody spoke. The same passengers who had watched her humiliation minutes earlier now stood completely still, as though afraid even the smallest sound might expose their own discomfort. Melissa Grant remained beside the boarding counter with rigid posture, her face pale beneath the bright airport lighting. Ethan Holloway stared toward the floor, unable to look directly at anyone anymore. The silence surrounding gate C-17 felt heavier than any confrontation. It was the silence of people recognizing themselves too late. Vivian walked several steps toward the jet bridge entrance before suddenly stopping. Captain Adrian Mercer paused beside her immediately. Thomas Riley straightened nervously nearby, uncertain what she might say next. Slowly, Vivian turned back toward the waiting passengers and airline staff. Her eyes moved calmly across the gate, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. Do you know what the strange thing is? She said softly. Her voice carried effortlessly through the silent terminal. This is not even close to the worst treatment I have seen in an airport. Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Melissa lowered her eyes immediately. Vivian continued calmly. I grew up watching my father work double shifts lifting baggage in winter storms while executives walked past him without ever seeing him as human. The room remained frozen around her words. And after I built my company, something interesting happened. She adjusted the sleeve of her gray coat lightly. The moment people discovered money or titles attached to my name, they suddenly became kind. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, shame spreading visibly across his face now. Vivian looked toward him for only a second before continuing. But kindness that depends on status is not kindness at all. The words landed with painful precision. Near the back of the crowd, a younger gate agent slowly wiped tears from her eyes while pretending to organize paperwork. Captain Mercer stood silently beside Vivian, saying nothing. He understood instinctively that moments like this could not be interrupted. They had to settle naturally into people's minds. Vivian looked once more toward Melissa. You know what the saddest part is? She asked gently. Melissa looked up carefully, her composure barely holding together. You probably would have treated my father the exact same way tonight. Melissa's lips trembled slightly, but no defense came. Because there was none. The room went completely still again. Outside the windows, lightning flashed faintly behind thick rain clouds rolling over the runway. The reflections shimmered across the polished marble floors like moving silver. Vivian exhaled softly before offering a small, sad smile. He used to tell me that the easiest test of character is how someone treats people who cannot benefit them. Thomas Riley lowered his head slightly at those words. Around the gate, passengers who had laughed earlier now looked deeply uncomfortable. Some quietly turned away. Others stared toward the floor, replaying the scene in their minds. Because now they understood something humiliating. None of them had stepped in. None of them had questioned the mockery while they believed Vivian was ordinary. Vivian glanced toward the jet bridge again before speaking one final time. Power does not change character, she said calmly. It only reveals it. No one dared respond. Captain Mercer finally gestured respectfully toward the aircraft entrance. Whenever you are ready, Miss Cole. Vivian nodded politely and began walking toward the jet bridge once more. As she disappeared down the corridor leading to the plane, the silence she left behind somehow became even louder. Melissa stood motionless behind the counter long after Vivian was gone. The polished image she had spent years building suddenly felt hollow and embarrassing. Ethan slowly picked up his briefcase without speaking. The arrogance that once defined his posture had vanished entirely. One older passenger near the front of the gate quietly shook his head. That woman never raised her voice once, he murmured softly. Nobody answered him because everyone understood the truth already. She never needed to. Several minutes later, as boarding finally resumed, the atmosphere around gate C-17 had changed completely. Passengers spoke more quietly. Employees smiled more carefully. Even simple interactions carried unusual gentleness now, as though everyone feared exposing the worst parts of themselves again. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered runway, the aircraft carrying Vivian Cole slowly prepared for departure, while an entire terminal remained haunted by a lesson no luxury lounge, first-class ticket, or executive title could ever teach them. Respect was never supposed to be reserved for the powerful. And that night at Reagan National Airport, a quiet woman in gray sneakers reminded everyone exactly what dignity looked like. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere felt completely different from the chaos left behind at Gate C-17. Soft amber lighting glowed across polished wood panels, while quiet instrumental music drifted gently through the spacious cabin. Most passengers had already settled into wide leather seats, speaking in low voices or staring out rain-covered windows as ground crews moved beneath flashing runway lights outside. But even here, whispers had already begun spreading. Several passengers recognized Vivian Cole now after searching her name online during boarding. A few glanced toward her discreetly as she walked down the aisle carrying her own bag without assistance. What surprised them most was not her wealth or influence. It was how ordinary she seemed. Vivian stopped beside seat 2A and calmly placed her carry-on into the overhead compartment herself before sitting beside the window. She removed her gray coat carefully and folded it across her lap. No dramatic phone calls. No demands. No assistant hovering nearby. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman in an elegant cream-colored blazer studied her nervously for several moments before finally speaking. Miss Cole. Vivian turned politely. Yes. The woman smiled awkwardly. I just wanted to say, the way you handled everything out there was remarkable. Vivian offered a small appreciative nod. Thank you. The woman hesitated before continuing more quietly. Most people with your level of influence probably would have had someone fired immediately. Vivian glanced briefly toward the rain sliding across the aircraft window beside her. Fear changes behavior temporarily, she replied softly. Understanding changes it permanently. The woman fell silent after that, visibly reflecting on the answer. A few rows behind them, Ethan Holloway sat rigidly in seat 4C, staring blankly at the seat back in front of him. Fate had delivered one final humiliation he never expected. After the gate incident, airline staff quietly reassigned his original premium suite seat due to operational adjustments related to Vivian's security accommodations. Nobody had argued with him directly. Nobody needed to. The hierarchy of importance had suddenly become painfully clear. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small. Truly small. He replayed his own words over and over in his head. You can always tell who belongs in first class. The memory now made his stomach twist with embarrassment. Nearby passengers recognized him too. A younger businessman seated across the aisle occasionally glanced toward Ethan with visible judgment after overhearing the confrontation earlier. Ethan could feel it. The silent shift in how people viewed him. Reputation, he realized too late, could collapse in minutes. Near the front galley, Captain Adrian Mercer quietly spoke with two senior flight attendants before the cabin door closed. Make sure Ms. Cole has complete privacy during the flight, he instructed calmly. One attendant nodded immediately. Of course, Captain. Adrian glanced toward Vivian's seat thoughtfully. During his years in aviation, He had transported celebrities, senators, athletes, and billionaires across the world. Many demanded attention constantly. But Vivian Cole carried herself differently. Her confidence did not depend on visibility. It came from certainty. That kind of quiet strength was rare. As boarding finished, the cabin settled into silence broken only by overhead announcements and the distant sound of rain hitting the aircraft fuselage. Vivian opened the thin folder she had been reviewing earlier at the gate. Inside were infrastructure proposals, emergency restructuring models, and operational forecasts tied to the struggling airline she was about to help save. Tens of thousands of jobs depended on the decisions waiting for her in Seattle. Pilots, gate agents, mechanics, flight attendants, families. Entire futures balanced quietly inside those papers resting in her lap. Yet only an hour earlier, people had dismissed her because of sneakers and a gray coat. The irony was impossible to ignore. Across the aisle, the woman in the cream blazer looked at Vivian again. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian looked up gently. "Of course." The woman hesitated. "Why do you dress so simply if you could afford anything?" Vivian smiled faintly at the question. It was one she had heard many times before. She glanced toward the dark runway lights shimmering outside the rain-streaked window. "Because I spent most of my life around people who believed expensive things made them important," she answered softly. "And I learned very early that real value usually arrives quietly." The woman slowly nodded, visibly moved by the answer. Moments later, the aircraft door sealed shut with a heavy mechanical sound. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane pushed back from the gate. Outside, far beyond the rain and terminal windows, Melissa Grant still stood motionless behind the empty boarding counter at gate C-17, replaying every decision she had made that evening while realizing something painful. The woman she judged as ordinary had shown more class, dignity, and restraint in 1 hour than most powerful people showed in an entire lifetime. 3 hours later, the rain over Seattle had turned into a cold silver mist drifting across the runway as Flight 427 touched down smoothly at SeaTac International Airport. Inside the quiet first-class cabin, passengers began gathering their belongings while soft overhead lights illuminated tired faces and wrinkled business jackets. But unlike most flights, nobody rushed to stand the moment the aircraft stopped moving. The atmosphere remained strangely restrained, almost respectful, as if the events back in Washington still lingered silently in everyone's mind. Vivian Cole calmly closed the folder, resting in her lap, and looked once through the window at the blurred runway lights outside. Captain Adrian Mercer's voice came softly over the cabin speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Seattle. Local time is 10:42 p.m., and the temperature outside is 51 degrees. Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate." His voice paused briefly before adding something unusual. "And on behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us tonight." Several passengers glanced subtly toward Vivian after hearing the emphasis in his tone. Ethan Holloway remained seated in silence near the middle of the cabin, staring blankly ahead while people around him quietly avoided conversation. The confidence that once radiated from him had disappeared completely. For perhaps the first time in years, he understood what humiliation actually felt like. As the aircraft connected to the jet bridge, 2 senior airport executives became visible outside the cabin door waiting near the entrance with security personnel and black SUVs positioned beyond the terminal windows. One passenger whispered softly, "They are here for her." Vivian stood calmly and slipped her gray coat back on before retrieving her carry-on from the overhead compartment herself despite nearby attendants immediately offering assistance. "I have it," she said gently with a small smile. The humility in that simple gesture did not go unnoticed. As passengers slowly exited the aircraft, many quietly stepped aside to let Vivian walk first. Nobody announced it. Nobody instructed them. Respect simply moved naturally through the cabin now. Ethan remained near the rear aisle until nearly everyone else had exited, but fate had one final moment waiting for him. As Vivian approached the aircraft door, Ethan suddenly stood from his seat and cleared his throat awkwardly. The entire nearby aisle seemed to pause. Vivian turned politely toward him. Ethan looked deeply uncomfortable, the polished arrogance that once defined him now completely absent beneath the soft cabin lights. "Ms. Cole," he began quietly, "I owe you an apology." Vivian listened silently. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. What I said earlier at the gate was arrogant and disrespectful. I judged you without knowing anything about you. The honesty in his voice surprised even himself. Vivian studied him for a moment before responding softly. Most people do not reveal who they are when things are comfortable, she said. Pressure reveals character. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand that now. Vivian's expression softened slightly. Then perhaps tonight was useful after all. She did not embarrass him further. She did not seek revenge. That restraint somehow humbled Ethan more deeply than public humiliation ever could have. Nearby passengers who overheard the exchange remained silent, watching carefully. Vivian then stepped through the aircraft doorway where airport executives immediately greeted her with visible respect. Miss Cole, one of them said warmly. The board members are waiting downtown. Vivian nodded politely, while airport staff quickly moved aside to clear her path. Yet, even surrounded by executives and security personnel, she still looked exactly the same as she had hours earlier at Gate C-17. Gray coat, quiet posture, calm eyes. Nothing external had changed, only the way people saw her. As Vivian walked through the private terminal corridor, Captain Adrian Mercer watched from the aircraft doorway thoughtfully. One of the younger flight attendants beside him shook her head softly. I still cannot believe how calm she stayed through all of that. Adrian looked toward the disappearing figure of Vivian Cole at the far end of the terminal. People with real strength rarely need to prove it loudly, he replied quietly. Outside, black SUVs waited beneath misty runway lights, while Seattle rain drifted softly across the pavement. Vivian paused briefly before entering the vehicle and looked back once toward the airport behind her. Thousands of travelers moved through terminals every hour. Most would never remember each other. But somewhere inside Reagan National Airport, one gate supervisor, one arrogant businessman, and dozens of silent witnesses would remember this night for the rest of their lives. Because for a few unforgettable hours, an ordinary-looking woman carrying a small leather bag had exposed how quickly society confuses appearance with worth. And in the silence she left behind, people were forced to confront something uncomfortable about themselves. By midnight, downtown Seattle shimmered beneath cold rain and reflected skyscraper lights as black SUVs carried Vivian Cole through nearly empty streets toward the towering glass headquarters of Cascadia Air Group. Inside the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor, tension had already settled heavily over the long walnut conference table where senior directors, investors, and legal advisors waited in nervous silence. Financial reports, restructuring plans, and emergency projections covered nearly every surface in the room. For months, the airline had been spiraling toward disaster. Rising operational losses, outdated infrastructure, and collapsing investor confidence had pushed the company dangerously close to financial collapse. Thousands of employees feared layoffs. Regional routes were already scheduled for cancellation. Tonight's meeting with Alteris Aerospace represented their final opportunity to survive. The boardroom doors finally opened shortly after 12:10 a.m. Every executive immediately stood as Vivian entered quietly, wearing the same gray coat and simple white sneakers she had worn all evening. The contrast was striking. Around her stood men and women in luxury suits worth thousands of dollars, yet none carried the quiet authority filling the room the moment she walked in. Vivian greeted everyone politely before taking a seat near the center of the table. Across from her sat Richard Vail, chairman of Cascadia Air Group, a veteran executive who had spent nearly 30 years in aviation leadership. Even he looked visibly exhausted now. Ms. Cole, Richard began carefully. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Vivian nodded once. Your team made it clear the situation was urgent. A faint, uneasy silence passed through the room before Richard spoke again. I was informed there was an incident during boarding tonight. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. News of the gate confrontation had already reached corporate leadership. Vivian rested her hands calmly on the table. There was a misunderstanding, she replied simply. Richard exhaled slowly. I assure you it is being addressed internally. Vivian looked toward the rain-covered skyline outside the massive windows before answering softly. It does not concern me personally. That response surprised several people in the room. Most executives expected outrage, demands, consequences. But Vivian's focus had never been revenge. Richard leaned forward slightly. Then why mention it at all? Vivian's eyes moved calmly back toward the table. Because the culture inside a company always reveals itself in moments when nobody thinks leadership is watching. The room fell silent instantly. Tonight was not about one gate supervisor. Vivian continued quietly. It was about an environment where people feel empowered to judge human worth based on appearances. No one interrupted her. That attitude eventually damages everything, she said. Customer trust, employee morale, leadership judgment, corporate identity. Several board members slowly lowered their eyes toward the table. Deep down, they knew she was right. Vivian opened the folder in front of her and calmly slid several documents across the table. Alteris is prepared to move forward with the partnership, she said. Relief visibly swept across the room almost instantly. One executive actually closed his eyes briefly in gratitude. But Vivian raised one hand gently before anyone could celebrate. However, she added softly, there will be conditions beyond financial restructuring. Richard straightened immediately. What kind of conditions? Vivian's expression remained composed. Mandatory leadership retraining across customer-facing departments. New employee dignity standards. Internal culture audits. Expanded frontline support programs. A younger executive frowned slightly. You want operational reform tied to the investment. Vivian nodded once. I want people treated like human beings before they become profitable customers. The room went completely quiet again. Outside, rain rolled slowly down the glass windows overlooking Seattle, while distant lightning illuminated the skyline for a brief second. Richard Vail stared thoughtfully at Vivian across the table. Then, slowly, the older executive smiled. Not the artificial smile of negotiation. A real one. You know, he said quietly, most people in your position would have walked into this room furious tonight. Vivian glanced down briefly before answering. Anger rarely builds anything lasting. Nobody spoke after that, because at that moment, every person in the boardroom understood something far more important than billion-dollar contracts or corporate survival. The woman sitting before them had already won long before she entered the room. Not because of wealth, not because of power, but because humiliation never changed her dignity. Hours later, as Seattle's rain finally began fading into early morning mist, Vivian Cole stepped alone onto the quiet rooftop terrace outside the boardroom overlooking the sleeping city below. The deal was signed. Thousands of jobs had been saved. Yet her thoughts drifted not toward contracts or headlines, but toward a crowded boarding gate back in Washington where strangers had revealed exactly who they were the moment they believed an ordinary woman had no value. Vivian closed her coat gently against the cold wind and looked out across the glowing city lights beneath the dark sky. Somewhere far below, airplanes moved silently through the night, carrying people rushing toward meetings, families, dreams, and second chances. And perhaps, after tonight, a few more of them would remember something simple before judging the next quiet stranger standing alone in line. Real dignity never announces itself loudly. It simply stands quietly in the room while arrogance exposes itself.